The first thing I saw when I carried the soup up Jonah Vale's porch was a boot print in the gray ash by his door and a dark smear on the latch thick enough to be blood. The second was Jonah himself, sitting just inside the shadow with his dead wife's rifle across his knees, looking at my soup pail as if it had climbed the steps without me. He did not lift the barrel. That told me more than if he had. A man ready to kill usually braces his shoulders and decides his face ahead of time. Jonah looked like a fence post after lightning, upright only because falling would cost him more strength than he still possessed. Wind moved through the cottonwoods near the creek and carried the smell of old smoke, wet leather, and a house that had forgotten what supper was. I lifted the pail a little. "Bean and bacon," I said. "Too much pepper." "Same as always." His mouth moved before the rest of him did. "She used to bring it every single Sunday." There are words that do not enter a room so much as settle over it. Those did. I felt them along my arms the way you feel cold creek water through a torn boot seam. His wife, Clara, had been buried 31 days. Folks in town said Jonah had gone half wild since fever took her and the baby both, living on coffee, grief, and whatever his dogs could steal off the porch. Folks say a great deal when they are safe in dry stores with sugar stacked behind them. That morning I had tied my apron over my black dress, filled my best tin pail, and walked the 2 miles from town because grief is meanest on Sundays. Before I tell you what waited inside that house, settle in wherever you are tonight and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. I have always believed stories land softer when you know how many quiet kitchens and back porches they are finding. I stepped past Jonah without asking permission because people in mourning do not always know when to say yes. The kitchen smelled of lamp oil, stale coffee, damp wool, and that hollow iron scent you get when a stove has gone cold too many days in a row. There was one plate on the table with a heel of bread turned hard as kindling. Beside it lay a folded paper stamped with the black seal of Silas Crow's bank. Jonah watched me set out bowls from the shelf as if the act were a language he no longer understood. He had not shaved. His beard had come in uneven and dark, making the skin beneath it look paler still. He was not an old man, perhaps 45, but sorrow had a way of adding years where the body had no wish for them. Over the mantel stood Clara's photograph in an oval frame, her mouth caught halfway into a smile, as if the camera had interrupted some kindness she was on the verge of offering. I knew the shape of that kindness. After my husband, Thomas Hale, froze in the January blow 3 winters earlier, and after my little boy followed him before spring because some losses are greedy, Clara Vale had appeared at my boarding house door with soup every Sunday for 2 months. She never asked whether I was healing. She never said the Lord had a purpose. She just sat by the window with her gloves in her lap and asked whether I wanted onions in the next pot. That is how some women keep other women alive. Quietly, repeatedly, without any wish to be called heroic for it. My thumb moved over the signature on the attached note. Supposedly Clara's. Something in me stopped as clean as a clock wound too tight. Clara had written her C with a broken first stroke ever since a mare kicked her hand 5 years earlier. I knew because I kept the donation ledger at church, and every month Clara signed beside sugar, flour, dried beans, or lamp wicks she meant to send to somebody too proud to ask. The C on this note was smooth and round, written by a hand that had never been broken. "She didn't sign this," I said. Jonah's eyes lifted slow and then sharp. It was the first live thing I had seen in them. I told him that. I ladled soup into a bowl and set it before him. "Eat while it's hot." "I ain't hungry." "Grief lies," I said. "It tells you hunger and sleep and mercy are weakness. Grief is wrong about most things." I opened cupboards looking for coffee grounds, clean cloth, any sign the house still belonged to the living. In the pantry, I found Clara's blue soup tureen on the top shelf, too fine for ordinary use, polished to a soft shine that grief had not yet managed to dull. I dusted its lid with my fingertips. Something beneath it gave a small hard click against wood. I looked down, but Jonah coughed in the kitchen and I let it be. That was my first mistake. My second waited in town, already packed in a trunk under my rented bed. The next morning I had meant to take the eastbound stage to Cheyenne and keep going until my sister's house in Nebraska looked more like future than charity. I had sold my extra dishes, mended my best hem, and folded Thomas's old wool scarf into the corner of my valise. There are times a person mistakes leaving for healing. I had made that mistake neat as laundry. "I can match this note against the church ledger," I said. If Clara's signature was forged, I can prove it. I looked at the black seal again. Then we find somebody who still does. Because she fed me when I could not bear the taste of my own life, I said. And because I am tired of cruel men behaving like God just because nobody interrupts them. The knock that followed was cheerful in the way only bad news ever is. Sheriff Del Mercer came in without waiting, broad hat still on, belly first, badge polished bright enough to make a virtue of itself. He had the habit of rubbing his thumb over the edge of that badge whenever he lied. He smiled without warmth. Bank's due in 3 days. Mr. Crow says if the place is cleared peaceable, he'll leave the stock to be counted fair. Then carry one back, I said. Tell Crow he's not taking this ranch on a lie. There it was. The price of defiance laid plain as bread on a table. My room at Mrs. Bartlett's. My 2 mornings a week in the hotel kitchen. My standing in town, small as it was. All balanced against a ranch not mine and a man I hardly knew except by the shape grief had carved in him. No, I said, folding the notice. I owe Clara. I should tell you this plain because halfway is how cowards speak. I nearly walked away anyway. I nearly returned to town, took my trunk, and climbed onto that stagecoach while the driver snapped the reins, and the whole life I had not loved rolled behind me towards someplace new where I could fail in quieter. Doing the right thing has never once felt convenient at the start. If it does, look closer. It may not be right at all. By noon I was beside Jonah on the wagon bench headed toward the church with the forged note under my palm and the back of my throat tasting of pennies. Behind us his house grew small against the brown late summer pasture, smoke rising from the stove I had coaxed back to work. Ahead waited the ledger, and perhaps the first honest choice I had made in years. I said. Now I'm reading a forgery. He let us inside because decency lives even in timid people, though it trembles badly. The sanctuary was cool and dim, with sun falling through colored glass in quiet strips across the pews. Dust moved in those beams like slow snow. I went straight to the vestry shelf where the church ledger always sat. It was gone. Reverend Cole swallowed hard. It was their last night. Who has keys? Jonah asked. We spent the afternoon building the beginning of an answer. Dr. Levin swore Clara had never regained full movement in that hand after the mayor kicked it. Mrs. Quinn at the Mercantile, who forever wiped the same clean spot on her counter until the varnish near gave up, remembered Clara complaining that Crow's Bank kept sending papers while Jonah was away buying wire. Mateo Alvarez from the livery said he had seen Amos Kit carrying a book shaped just like the missing ledger under his coat that morning, though the day had been dry as bone. Not one of them wanted to speak publicly. Crow sold seed on credit, loaned feed at planting, and foreclosed with a smile that made men apologize while he emptied their lives into his pockets. Fear had taught the town to bow so long their backs had forgotten upright. Jonah bore each soft refusal like a fresh bruise. Twice I saw him turn his face away before anger did the talking for him. Once, outside Dr. Levin's office, he braced both hands on the hitch rail and stared at the road until it was just dust again. You can still leave, he said without looking at me. Coach tomorrow at noon. Loneliness will make a body lie to itself, I said. It'll call hiding peace if you let it. He glanced up then. That was the first time my words stayed in his eyes after I'd spoken them. Near sundown, we found Amos Kit behind the bank, bent over as if the alley itself were accusing him. He was a thin man with ink dark in the half-moons of his nails and a collar always too tight for the heat. The moment he saw Jonah, fear climbed him so fast, it almost passed for guilt. I ain't talking here, he whispered. Then talk somewhere else, I said. His eyes slid toward Main Street, where Silas Crow stood laughing with 2 cattle buyers beneath the hotel awning. Crow wore wealth the way some men wear cologne, too much and on purpose. Silver watch chain, black coat too fine for August, boots polished enough to reflect who was kneeling. He was not a large man. Men like him rarely are. They learn early that power travels cheaper through signatures and obedient cowards than through fists. Amos swallowed. She knew, he said. Clara. Jonah's voice went flat. Amos nodded. Crow had me draw notes against 3 places this spring. Easy work at first. Drought had folks borrowing. Then he started adding terms after they signed. Creek access. Back pasture. Fees he never named. Mrs. Vale came in after one widow showed her a paper. She said she'd compare every signature in town if she had to. Mr. Crow told me if I valued my job, I'd keep my pen shut. Did she take copies? I asked. Truth had a habit of turning up in kitchens. Crow says stay away from his bank, he told Jonah. Next time he'll have you jailed for disturbing decent business. I've seen men mistake themselves untouchable, I said. That seems the worse error. His smile widened. Auction Sunday after service. Crow figured your wife would have liked the timing. If you had been standing there with a packed trunk at your feet and a clear road out of town, what would you have done? Would you have taken the safe leaving or the dangerous staying? Let me know down in the comments, because it is easy to be brave in theory and far harder when the coach wheels are already turning. The storm did not come from the sky. Jonah's ranch glowed against the dark like a dropped lantern. Flames ran the haystack in red sheets, throwing sparks high enough to start a second sunrise. Jonah was already at the pump, shirt stuck to his back, passing buckets from trough to dirt. His dogs lunged at the shadows and came back coughing. Somewhere cattle bawled with that deep, cracked note animals use when they smell flame and fear together. Then I saw the riders on the rise. 3 of them. Watching. Action strips a mind clean. There is no room for anything but next. I grabbed a bucket. Ran. Threw. Ran again. Smoke clawed my throat raw. Jonah shouted for me to get clear, then cursed when I ignored him. One rider fired into the air. Horses hammered the corral rails till the wood screamed. They want the stock loose, Jonah barked. If the cattle scatter, Crow claims abandoned range. Jonah vaulted the fence. I followed. He put one hand on the lead gelding's nose, another under its cheek, and spoke one low word close to the ear. The animal shivered once and stilled. That was his gift. Not strength. Measure. He could feel exactly how much fear a living thing could carry before it broke, and he knew how to ease it back from the edge. Dutch Gannon came off the rise with a torch in hand and hurled it through the open barn. Jonah went for Dutch. I ran for the house. Found you, I said, and my own voice sounded like a stranger's. When I turned, Silas Crow filled the doorway. He had taken off his coat. Men are often truest stripped a little of performance. He was lean, dust gray, and ugly only in the eyes. In his hand, he held Clara's little nickel-plated pistol, as though it were some distasteful object he had been forced to touch. You lit the hay, I said, though I already knew. Her creek. His pasture. The Bartlett house. Half the Little Widow places north of town. Railroad survey comes through by spring. Land buys cheapest when the owners are thirsty or grieving. He stepped forward. You see why I can't have that tin riding back to town. You should have learned something from the women you kept undercounting, I said. He smiled then, thin and cold. I did. I learned they break quieter. He lunged. I swung the tureen lid at his face. China shattered. He cursed, and the pistol fired, blasting the window glass over the sink. I shoved past him with the tin crushed to my ribs, boots slipping on shards and hot grease from the stove. Outside, Jonah hit Crow hard enough to send both men into the porch rail. Dutch came from the yard with a rifle butt. Bear leaped for his arm. Patch tore at a trouser leg. Another shot cracked. Jonah jerked once, staggered, and still got himself between me and the men in the yard. We got the horses loose. We got clear of the main fire. We did not get peace. Riders came after us through the back pasture, shadows cutting across the red glow of the burning hay. Jonah swayed in the saddle beside me, one hand clamped to his shoulder, the other guiding his mare with knee and instinct. I had the tin tucked under my arm and Clara's courage beating inside it like a second heart. At the creek crossing, Jonah pointed toward the abandoned line shack in the cottonwoods. There, he gritted. He looked at the tin in my lap. Tell me that was worth getting shot over. I unwound the oilcloth with shaking fingers. Inside lay copied notes, hidden deeds, 3 statements signed by ranchers who had never seen half the terms on their loans, and a letter addressed in Clara's hand to County Judge Wellerpike in Cheyenne. The first line read, "If this reaches you without me, it means Silas Crow moved sooner than I guessed." The quiet after violence is its own kind of weather. By noon, the riders had pulled back beyond rifle range and settled to watch from the tree line. They knew Jonah was wounded. They knew we had little water. Men like Crow prefer pressure to effort whenever pressure will do. I cleaned Jonah's shoulder with boiled water from the shack kettle and a strip torn from my petticoat. The bullet had ripped through flesh, not bone. Lucky is too pretty a word for pain that deep, but it was the right sort of bad news. He clenched his jaw and watched the ceiling while I worked. When the bandage was tied, I sat back on my heels. Light came through the cracks in the wall in thin white slivers, striping his face and hands. Outside, cicadas screamed in the heat. The whole shack smelled of pine pitch, old wool, blood, and dust warming under sun. I looked down at my hands. She brought it to me too. After Thomas died, he was silent for a while. Then he said, "I've been setting 2 bowls on Sundays." His face tightened. "Some mornings I wake before light, and for half a blink I think if I get the fire going quick enough, she'll come down tying that blue apron." Then I remember. Every day since has felt like somebody handed me my own body back missing parts. When Thomas died, I said, people kept saying time would do its work, as if grief were a stain and not weather. It isn't. It changes. It moves through. It leaves some things standing and tears others clean out of the ground. But it does not ask permission. He turned his head toward me. "Then how do you go on?" "You feed what still lives," I said, "even if all you have is soup and stubbornness. If that line found you where you live, then this story was written for you. And if you want more stories that tell the truth about love, loss, and the people who keep showing up anyway, a like and a subscribe helps us keep telling them." He slept after that, feverish but easier. I used the time. Clara's letter laid everything bare. Crow had been buying up drought-hurt land through forged amendments and hidden fees, while quietly courting a railroad surveyor who meant to run line near Jonah's Creek come spring. Control the water, control the valley. Tucked beneath the letter was one more page. A signed statement from Amos Kit confessing that he had altered notes at Crow's order and naming Sheriff Mercer as the man who removed any record that might prove it. By late afternoon, I had copied every line twice into an old inventory book I found under the bunk. My hand cramped. My eyes burned. I kept going. If Crow burned one packet, I intended half the county to be holding the rest before the day was done. When Jonah woke, I told him the plan. He pushed himself upright with a hiss. "Sheriff Mercer will jail me on sight." "We were never clear," I answered. "We were only quiet." I handed him one packet of copies. "Take these to Mrs. Quinn, Dr. Levin, Mrs. Bartlett, Reverend Cole, and every widow Crow thinks too frightened to speak. Tell them to read before church. Tell them if they still want silence after that, I won't blame them. But I will know." Before we left the shack, Jonah touched my wrist. "Nora, if we get through tomorrow," he said, and stopped because men like him do not spend words cheap. "If we get through tomorrow, I don't want that porch empty again." We rode the creek bed into town under moonlight, the water sucking softly at the horses' fetlocks, willow branches brushing our sleeves. Warmth sat between us, but not safety. On the ridge now and again a rider showed black against the sky and vanished. The world was still hunting. By the time we reached town, the churchyard was filling. Wagons, buggies, dust-coated boots, women in washed calico, children scrubbed into obedience. Silas Crow stood near the hitch rail in his black coat again, shoulder to shoulder with Sheriff Mercer, both wearing the easy faces of men who believe the day belonged to them. Mrs. Quinn saw me first. She did not wave. She simply lifted her chin. Under her arm lay the missing church ledger wrapped in brown paper. Behind her stood Mrs. Bartlett with her sister's boys, Dr. Levin in a collar too tight for his neck, Mateo near the steps with a jaw set harder than his years, and 4 widows from the North Road, holding folded copies in work-roughened hands. "By authority of county lien and bank security," he called, "the Jonah Vale property and improvements shall be offered at public auction." No, my own voice surprised me. It carried clean. The yard turned. I climbed the church steps with Clara's original packet in one hand and the copied pages in the other. Jonah stood at my shoulder, pale but upright. Every eye in that yard moved between us and Crow, as if watching a match hover over dry straw. The sheriff tried to smile. "Miss Hale, this is no place for kitchen emotion." "Then you're fortunate," I said. "I brought paperwork." I lifted the forged note. "This paper says Clara Vale pledged her creek and pasture against a medical debt. Dr. Levin can swear her hand never wrote this signature. Mrs. Quinn can compare it to the church ledger Sheriff Mercer removed yesterday morning. And if that is not enough, Amos Kit put in writing exactly how Silas Crow ordered these papers altered. Mrs. Lydia Henshaw. 2 notes combined without consent. Creek access added after signature. Ezra Vance, veteran, parcel split into east and west descriptions, so either half may be seized on missed interest. Martha Bartlett, Duplicate mortgage filed under boarding house parcel and again under her sister's name. Rafael Cortez, feed credit marked triple after drought losses. No, said Mrs. Bartlett from the yard, voice shaking so hard it came out brave. She held up her copy. Read mine again. Then Mrs. Quinn raised the missing church ledger in both hands. And here is the book our sheriff borrowed without asking. Sheriff Mercer lunged for the ledger. Jonah stepped between them. He did not raise his fist. He only stood there with that quiet steadiness of his, wounded and unblinking. And for the first time the sheriff looked at another man and saw not a mark but a wall. I held up the final page. No, I said. I think your own clerk can. For one long second I thought cowardice would win. It often does. Then Amos stepped forward with both hands shaking and said, I wrote them. I changed them. He ordered it. He pointed at Crow with an ink-stained finger that looked steadier than the rest of him. Sheriff Mercer removed the comparison books. Mrs. Vale said she'd take the copies to Judge Pike herself. Mr. Crow told me if she did, he'd see me broke and beaten. I stayed quiet. That part is on me. The rest is on him. I stamped his instep with my heel, drove my elbow back, and twisted the way Thomas had once taught me when freight men got too friendly after whiskey. Crow loosened his grip for one breath. It was enough. I snatched the iron kettle hook hanging from the church supper cauldron beside the steps and caught his wrist with it. By then the town had changed shape. Dr. Levin had both hands on Sheriff Mercer's gun arm, with strength nobody had thought to assign him. Mrs. Bartlett's sister stood between Crow and his horse with a garden fork lifted like a judgment. Mateo had slashed the bank wagon traces, sending the team sidelong into Crow's path. And Jonah, white with pain and bleeding through the bandage, rose from the dirt with the sheriff's revolver in his hand and said, not loudly at all, it's over. Crow looked around and found no open space where obedience used to stand. He lunged anyway, because men built on power cannot imagine their bodies answering to limits. Jonah fired once into the church bell above the door. The clang split the morning wide. Horses shied. Children cried out. Crow froze. Justice, when it finally comes, is less like thunder than people believe. It is paperwork retrieved. Voices added. Cowards deciding they are tired of the taste of it. By noon Silas Crow and Sheriff Mercer sat under guard in the bank office, while Reverend Cole sent riders for Judge Pike and the territorial marshal out of Cheyenne. By evening Amos had opened the vault with hands so unsteady Mateo had to hold the lantern for him, and inside they found enough duplicate deeds, blank signed pages, and hidden notes to ruin Crow beyond mending. Everything he had built came apart the way it had been made, piece by crooked piece, and all of it in public. The bank was placed under outside receivership. The false liens were suspended before sunset. The widow places were restored. Mrs. Bartlett burned her duplicate mortgage in the hotel stove herself and cried only after the edges curled white. There were other reckonings too. Dutch Gannon turned on Crow before dark and named the men paid to fire the hay and cut the fences. Sheriff Mercer lost his badge, his office, and any welcome polite people had once pretended to extend him. Amos Kit kept his freedom only because the truth arrived before the last possible minute, and because Clara Vale had believed shame could still be put to useful work if it finally bent toward honesty. By the time the crowd thinned, the churchyard smelled of trampled grass, black coffee, and mutton stew meant for the fellowship dinner nobody had felt much like eating until danger passed. Then, as if a spell had broken, spoons appeared. Children ran. Women pressed bread into hands that had shaken all morning. Somebody laughed too loudly. Somebody else laughed because of that. Life came back indecently quick, the way it always does once fear is not being fed every hour. Jonah stood near the pump, one hand braced on the handle. I crossed the yard with a bowl drawn from the cauldron. Soup again, I said. He took the bowl, but not before his fingers closed around mine. Warm, steady, chosen. I don't know what comes after this, he said. First, I told him, you eat before it gets cold. Then we see. His thumb brushed my knuckles once. Stay next Sunday. I thought of my unopened trunk. Thomas's scarf over Mrs. Bartlett's banister. Clara's blue tureen waiting on a pantry shelf in a house that had nearly burned and had not. Of the way Jonah had said over and meant not only the fight, but the long lie hanging over all of us. I think, I said slowly, I've been staying since the moment I missed that coach. Weeks later, When the worst edge of scandal had worn down and the county had found a new sheriff who removed his hat at every doorway, Sunday returned to the Vale house, like a promise finally believed. The kitchen windows stood open to early autumn. Coffee steamed at the back of the stove. Bear snored beneath the table, while Patch waited hopefully at the smell of ham. Jonah came in from the north fence with dust on his boots and sun along his shoulders, and I set down 2 bowls, then a third for Mateo, who could never arrive at supper without pretending he had not meant to. On the pantry shelf, Clara's blue tureen caught the late light. Turns out a home is not the place that never breaks. It is the place that learns how to feed the living anyway. And the last of the sun lay across the Vale porch like a long gold tablecloth no sorrow could ever pull away. Next time, we'll tell the story of the deaf seamstress sent to a mountain sheep ranch because her brothers were ashamed of her, and the scarred widower who learned her silence could hear every lie in the valley.